All right, welcome everyone to our 2 Corinthians series overview. We're doing something different with our video. We're being a little bit fancy. I've even got my pot plant here that usually sits in my toilet. 2 Corinthians is our book of the year. This video works best, by the way, if you've read 2 Corinthians at least once through yourself already. So if you haven't done that, kind of stop the video, take 10 minutes to read it, because you won't really appreciate most of this stuff if you haven't got a sense of the letter yourself. I'm really looking forward to it. Hopefully this Lifeblood series has got everyone in our church asking, what does it look like to serve God with, His word, prayer and people? What does it actually look like in real life? And 2 Corinthians is going to be great for that. I think as we imagine our Christian life and ministry, often we think, or we hope, that it's going to be pain-free and pleasure-filled and we're just going to succeed and we're going to accomplish. But that's not life. And 2 Corinthians really actually reminds us that that is not the norm. In fact, the norm is that it's going to be really messy. Why? Because, the world is messy. In fact, people are messy. You're messy and I'm messy. And so the letter will kind of remind us of what it means to actually serve in God's training ground for all of us, right? That this is actually part of God's design. It's going to teach us to be confident in the weak ministry of gospel proclamation, right? In our weakness, we show the power of proclaiming the gospel. Maybe when we think about that doesn't sound very motivating. In fact, it sounds like a bit of a downer. That's not what we're trying to say. We're not even trying to be realist here. We're actually trying to consider the nature of the gospel, right? The person of Jesus. Because when we think about Jesus and his gospel, there's this kind of paradoxical glory to all of it, isn't there? We kind of see life in death, power in weakness, comfort in affliction. That's how Jesus and the gospel came to us. And so our life in him is going to echo that. And so 2 Corinthians really just focuses our mind on our weaknesses, our frustrations, our limitations, and at the same time shines God's glory and power onto that. So hopefully we can show our church what it really looks like to want to serve God in that way. Well, let's dive into a bit of the background to the letter. If you didn't know, the Apostle Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. He wrote around 55 AD. Now, as you read 2 Corinthians, you're probably sensing there seems to be a lot of specific stuff that Paul's referring to in the letter. It can be a little bit kind of confusing because, what's this referring to? And so a timeline is really helpful that we kind of piece together from 1 and 2 Corinthians in terms of just understanding what Paul's really speaking to. So let's have a look at the timeline here. First we see Paul planted the church on his second missionary journey, probably somewhere around 50 AD. He was there for about 2 years and then he left to head towards Ephesus. We know that after he left, he probably wrote a letter. We know that from 1 Corinthians 5, addressing some issues, probably of sexual immorality that was happening in the church. At the same time, he probably sent Titus to go there to kind of start this collection that we also read about. Now, whilst Paul is in Ephesus, the Corinthians kind of write to Paul about some of the issues that was going on in the church. And we also know that a group of people came from Chloe to tell Paul of the disagreements and the divisions that were happening there. And so kind of Paul having received all that, Paul writes 1 Corinthians to respond to their questions. And at the same time, he sends Timothy either with the letter or soon after the letter to care for them. Now, we read at the end of 1 Corinthians that Paul plans to visit them again. And so Paul is going to visit at least twice by the sounds of it. Now, what happens, so that's 1 Corinthians. And then from 2 Corinthians, we can see that Paul had to make a surprise, painful visit, he calls it, to the Corinthians. Most likely because Timothy came back with probably bad news that the letter didn't resolve everything. There's still kind of conflict there. And so Paul had to go and address it himself. It was a painful visit because it wasn't fully resolved. In fact, things got pretty heated. Paul had to leave with lots of things probably still left hanging and still working themselves out. During that visit, it sounds like Paul said that he would probably visit them twice, afterwards. But instead of doing that, Paul ended up writing a harsh letter, a severe letter, to kind of address some of those unresolved issues. Again, he probably sent Titus with this letter, or soon after the letter, and Paul kind of gets Titus coming back to him with an encouraging report that lots of these people, though they were grieved by this letter, it was a godly grief and they repented. And so what we have in 2 Corinthians is Paul responding to the report of Titus and wanting to prepare them for his third and final visit. So that's why Paul refers to all this stuff that's kind of happened. He's just trying to kind of clear up all of that stuff as he continues to move forward in the second half of the letter. So Paul's aim in the letter really, in the first section, is to recount and clear up what his ministry with them has been really about. The second part in chapters 8 to 9 is to complete that giving project that they had started. And thirdly, in the final bits, to resolve some of those really harmful, lingering issues before his third visit. A bit more context about the book of 2 Corinthians. Corinth was a really important town. It was a massive trade center. You can see there on the map that it was in a really strategic position. In terms of other churches in the area, there's Thessalonica there, there's Ephesus there, and together they kind of form this triangle that covers that region. So, Corinth was an important city, it was an important church. The biblical context is, as you know, it's a New Testament letter, it's written to Christians, it's about how to live out the gospel, especially in light of some of the specific issues they were going through. The literary context, there's a little, you probably noticed that this letter seems a lot more personal, and so it's a little bit less systematic. It's a little bit more disjointed, especially if you compare it to 1 Corinthians that was written a year before it, and Romans that was written about a year after it. 2 Corinthians is just a little bit more messy. Now, some people, if you pick up a commentary, some people have thought maybe it's not actually one letter, maybe it's bits and pieces smooshed together. I don't think so. I think it was a messy situation. This was maybe a little more rushed in production, and so it's just a little less systematic in that way. But we can see that all throughout the letter, I think, in its themes and its tone, right? There's that kind of duality. Paul is really kind of compassionate and encouraging towards them, but at the same time, there's a sense of defensiveness, there's a sense of even threatening towards them as well. So, I think it's one whole letter. And we can probably see that in the structure as well. Again, there's 3 key sections to it. Paul looks at his ministry and he shows them kind of, why his ministry is a gospel-centered biblical ministry. And then he talk about, again, the giving project to Jerusalem. And finally, Paul wants to kind of really hit home some of those issues with false teachers and false teaching in their church. Let's think about some key themes. Right? Maybe as you read 2 Corinthians, you jotted down some notes about the things that really stood out to you. Let me kind of quickly go through some of the things that I've picked up. The first one, which will be immediately obvious, is that Paul is defending his ministry. But he's not just defending his ministry, he's also upholding what gospel ministry really should just look like, full stop. And so what you'll see in the letter is that Paul is kind of defending all sorts of things, his decisions, his suffering, his ministry, his credentials. And what we see there is Paul's heart, isn't it? There's a simple and sincere love for the people in the midst of a complicated web of breakdowns and building it back up. And so you really see Paul's character, don't you? But we shouldn't just think that this is Paul speaking to specific problems. You might be asking, Paul changed his plans. Paul had a fight with this person. How does that apply to me? Well, Paul tells us that actually, whilst he's been defending himself, he hasn't just been doing that. At the end of the letter, he says, we've been speaking in Christ, or for your upbuilding. In fact, we'll notice in the very opening in the letter that this letter was written not to the church in Corinth, but to the churches in Achaia. So he expects a wider audience. So as Paul actually defends himself, he's actually theologizing. He's saying, this is what a new covenant ministry is actually all about. This is why change doesn't mean we've shaken our confidence in what gospel ministry is about. So Paul's constantly kind of theologizing and reaching into broader principles to teach you and me. So it's really important that we recognize that. A second theme that is probably really prominent as well, you probably read in chapter 1, affliction and comfort, affliction and comfort. There's kind of those, I call them suffering catalogs that Paul recounts in a really moving way, the things he's had to go through for the sake of Jesus. So affliction, he's saying, should be no stranger to the Christian life, right? Jesus died to give us life, and so we share in the suffering of Christ as we share in his life and comfort. Now, a note about comfort. Comfort is not about, in this letter at least, kind of escape or relief. Again, it's not about being pain-free. Instead, it's more about having the courage, right? Having the strength to face the circumstances that you find yourself in. And where do we look to for that? We look to that from God. There's a wonderful quote here from David Garland kind of explaining that. And so, suffering and sacrifice, that's a part of the Christian life, right? That's a part of Christian ministry. At the same time, comfort and encouragement is also a part of the package. So you need to know how those two things tie together in your life and ministry. Now, as Paul kind of talks about all the specifics, he constantly shows us the power and the glory of God. You probably picked up time and time again that Paul talks about God's power. He powerful to raise the dead, powerful to shine his creative light into our hearts to save us. He shows us Christ, who is, this new glory, who's the image of God, who's the amen to all of God's promises. And then he shows us the Holy Spirit, the Lord and the giver of life, the one who can remove the veil from our hearts, apply God's power to transform us from one degree of glory to another. So you have this kind of really awesome picture of God's Trinitarian work and his power kind of all throughout this. And of course, why that is particularly relevant here is because Paul wants to say that God's grace is sufficient for us. God's power is made perfect in our weakness, right? That's how we face our weakness. That's how we face our limitations. That's how we face, doomy, gloomy circumstances in life and ministry. So God has kind of given us a sense of who he is so that we can know who we are and we can keep living and trusting him in that. Which of course brings us to this other theme of weakness, which kind of complements God's strength, doesn't it? In our culture, in our upbringing, maybe even, succeeding, achieving, performing, getting outcomes, that's a part of the air we breathe, isn't it? So we kind of bring that into the Christian life as well. If God is really for us, then we should be succeeding. We should be able to achieve everything that we thought we would be able to. But that's not the case for Paul, and that's not the case for anyone, really. This kind of triumphalistic, self kind of potential way of seeing ministry in the Christian life is just not what the Bible talks about. And so Paul here gives us a really countercultural but Christ-centered, gospel-centered way of seeing ministry. Here's a wonderful bit of insight from William Taylor here, which is when he has this conference where he talks to the leaders, and he wants to remind everyone that if you're going to put your hand up and serve Jesus, if you're going to, dig into serving people and dig into ministry, you will come across frustrations, limitations. And so we need to recognize that that's normal. That is a part of the package. And we need people to know what ministry really feels like and really looks like, and not have these kind of unrealistic expectations that leads them to burnout, that leads them to lose their love and strength for God. This is a really important part of the letter, which I'm hoping will shine through. There's another really key theme here about grace and generosity, in the context of the giving project to the poor in Jerusalem. And Paul really kind of shows us that our generosity is a outworking of God's grace, right? Again, the practical issue and the theology there. A heart that is satisfied by the grace of God will have the shape of generosity. This generosity doesn't just extend to our church, which is what Paul has been talking about. It extends to the wider kind of family of God. The Macedonians were doing a great job of that. Paul is encouraging the Corinthians to do that as well. And that radical generosity, again, is a sign of the gospel, isn't it? This kind of countercultural gospel taking form in our lives. The last theme here is, and we'll see this particularly in the last section, is boasting and commending ourselves. A group of so-called super apostles had infiltrated Corinth, and they were all for the world's methodologies, right? Kind of this self-promoting, people-pleasing kind of methodology. Look at how good we are, look at how effective we are. And so Paul is just kind of attacking that sort of arrogance, that kind of godless confidence that these people were not only kind of showing themselves, but teaching other people as well. So Paul kind of says instead he wants to serve in the meekness and in the gentleness of Christ. Right? He wants to let the nature of the gospel, the nature of God's love, characterize his ministry. Now, that doesn't mean that Paul isn't willing to put his foot down for the sake of the gospel. We see that in chapter 13. Paul is kind of drawing a line and says, get yourselves ready, test yourself, examine yourselves, because when I come, I want to see that you guys have taken action and stood up for Jesus here. So again, Paul is trying to argue not for a self-confidence, but a trust in God's power and being able to use that appropriately. So we don't boast or commend ourselves in that sort of way, in that sort of worldly way, but instead we want to see God's truth and God's glory come through. So there's some themes there. Let's think about what we want to see in our people as we go through 2 Corinthians, right? Maybe here's a moment for you to think about what you want to be learning or how you want to be transformed as we go through 2 Corinthians. But I've got a couple of points for us here. In terms of our head, our knowledge, our convictions, we want to just be in awe of who God is, right? So often I think Christians are at a distance from God. And so they have little motivation to live the life God has called them to serve in the way God has called them to, because they forget that there is an all-powerful God working in this world and working in us. So hopefully, as we look at who God is, that is just making a massive impression on our minds and our hearts. But the other thing is, we also want people to have a theology of ministry. We want people to understand what gospel ministry is really about, right? It's about loving people, growing them in the gospel. It's not about self-promoting. It's not about, looking good or anything like that. We really, don't want our own experiences and expectations of success or letting church stuff feed our insecurity. That's not what we want. We want people to know what it means to serve out of God's power, to serve in our weakness, and to serve God's people and God's purposes, right? So we want people to have a robust theology of what serving actually means. When it comes to our hearts, I think resisting pride is going to be a big one. We, most of us at least, have grown up in middle, upper class, achieving, professional, well-to-do kind of environments. And so we think we can do a lot of things. But we need to resist that sort of arrogance, that sort of self-sufficiency. Instead, we want to show our dependence on God. The other one is resilience, right? So many people I talk to, and I'm sure it's the same with you, they have all sorts of tough seasons in life. How do you bounce back? How do you keep going? There's a really important question for, so many leaders I talk to in our church, outside of church, go through bouts of, lack of motivation, depression, on the verge of burning out or even burnout, right? How do we keep ourselves going? Right, how do we have this strength in our hearts and in our lives to keep going for God? Well, 2 Corinthians really just tackles this issue, right? In how Paul has managed to kind of time and time again trust God, depend on Him, let God's power be perfected in His weakness, right? So we want our people to have a really vivid sense of that in their lives. In terms of actions, what do we want to see? We want to see people committing their lives, right? Church, Jesus, the gospel, it's work. It's not your Sunday club. It's not an extracurricular activity. It doesn't play second fiddle to your career, to your family. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, when Christ calls people to Him, He bids them to come and die, right? Bids them to give their life away. And that's what we want people to see in Paul and hopefully in themselves, right? To commit to giving their lives away for the sake of Jesus, knowing that there is a greater comfort and the eternal weight of glory that awaits us. We want people to commit to loving, generous, sacrificial service, all the things we see in this letter. And finally, we want to see people equipped, Hopefully, as you can see in Paul, hopefully you can see the things he's kind of talking about, that there is plenty of room to grow, right? If you've been leading small groups for 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, if you're an elder, if you're a M-team leader, whatever you are, right? There is room to grow, right? If you're someone who's brand new to church, there is room to grow, right? To know how to serve people, to know how to speak the gospel in really tough situations, to know how to proclaim the simple and sincere gospel ministry in a clear and unshakable way, right? There are things that we want, and hopefully we have the strength and the motivation from turning to God and depending on Him to want to grow in doing that. So there's some of the things which I want to see our church grow in as a result of learning from 2 Corinthians. Maybe now's a time for you to think about how you want to grow and how you want your people and the people around you to be growing in 2 Corinthians. Hopefully we have a great time. So join me in praying for the church, praying for yourself, praying for me in learning how to minister in a way that reflects God's power even in our weakness.